This program is brought to you by Emory University.
All right. Good evening. I can't whistle. I would if I could. Get everybody's attention. Need an official whistler. I'm Phil Thompson, the director of the Aquinas Center of Theology, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. You're about to hear an excellent lecture by Dr. Patrick Allett, a Newman for all seasons. So I'm very, very thrilled to see you here, and I understand there's some terrible traffic problems out there, so thank you for making it through that if you did. We're especially appreciative of you being here tonight. Let me thank just a couple of people real quick. Specifically, my assistant, Beverly Osterber over here, who's walking and didn't know I was going to do this. There's a lot that goes into what we do on a program on a lot of different levels, and she did that. And my son, who I guess is not here, but you might have seen him outside with a flashlight. And yeah, that's right. I do that to my children, my child, You're 18, but guess what you get to do tonight? Oh, thanks, Dad. But there's a couple of pieces you have in front of you, a couple of things either in front of you or over on the desk here. Most importantly is this, at the end of Patrick's talk is an assessment card. If you would fill this out, you've got pens, or Beverly will pass those out, pens and pencils, and it'll take about 60 seconds. So please just circle things and fill this out. If you have any comments, we love those. We give those to our board members, which are some of the people up here in the front row, our board members, and they really like to know what you think about the event. And it includes both the speaker but also parking and issues of that kind. So we try to improve what we do every time. So if you would fill that out. You've also got a little brochure available on the Aquinas Center. We have those over here, as well as a flyer for the Atlanta Catholic Business Conference. If you're interested in how to connect your faith to your work, it's a day-long program in January, and it's really, really good. The Archbishop is going to be the plenary speaker this year. That's Archbishop Wilton Gregory. And then coming in March, we have a French Dominican, Jacques Arnould, who's an award-winning writer on religion and science, a big Teilhard de Chardin scholar. And we're very thrilled. I saw him at an evolution conference at the Vatican a couple of years ago, and he was the best speaker I saw there. So I solicited him to come and give a couple of talks here at the university. So it'll be February 28th, March 1st, and we'll have more information out on that. He'll be talking about Catholicism and evolution. And he's also, interestingly enough, an ethics advisor to the French Space Agency, CNES. So a very interesting person. Hope you will come to that. And then in April, we're going to have our major Catholic speaker, who we at least now know who that is. And we're very thrilled about it, but I can't tell you because I literally just found out. So we're going to have to, we will, believe me, you're going to be tired of hearing from me eventually on this. But we're very excited about that. And we had the Cardinal Casper from the Vatican last year, and we're very much looking forward to the speaker, another major speaker this year. So that's what's coming up in our world. And one other thing you have, there's a bioethics event, which should also be on your tables. Oh, I'm sorry, they're on the far tables. The chairperson of the National Bioethics Commission, Dr. Amy Gutman, and of course James Wagner, the president of Emory, who's the vice chair of that commission, are going to be giving a talk in about a week at the CDC, and there's more information. I don't always plug other people's activities because there's so many here at Emory, but that really is special to come hear those two people talk about the very important issue of bioethics. So, and also, since the Center for Ethics was gracious enough to give us this room, I thought I'd also give them a little plug for something that's coming down with them. They do a lot of great work here. Now, let's turn to our topic tonight. I'm sorry, one final thing. We do have there's some occasional paper on Cardinal Newman that was done at the Aquinas Center by a speaker in 1997 about if you're interested in Newman's idea of the university, his famous work. It's a wonderful paper, and I'm breaking that down for you. So we have a few extra copies. Welcome to take those before you leave. Now turning to Newman. And as you may or may not know, Cardinal Newman was beatified, and this is part of the process of canonization in the Catholic Church on September 19th in England. And we've done a number of Newman activities this fall, sort of in honor of that. At the Pitts Theological Library, they have a lot of Newman's letters, and Pat Graham was kind enough to actually create a display there at the Pitts Theological Library. Father Brian at the Catholic Center did a mass in honor of Cardinal Newman, which actually he also had a little shrine to Cardinal Newman with some of his letters as part of that process. And now the third piece is to have this lecture by Dr. Patrick Allett on Cardinal Newman, a Newman for all seasons. And Newman is, I think it's fair to say, and maybe I'm making too bold a claim, but I think he's certainly in the last couple hundred years the most famous Anglo-American Catholic theologian and thinker. And I think it's fair to say that it's hard to think of somebody who's had more influence, say, since Vatican II than Cardinal Newman on a wide array of Catholic thinkers from all different kinds of spectrums. And so it's interesting to think about why Newman is so popular in his many different aspects. And one of the things why it's important to have talks like this is to sort of unpack a little bit about who Newman was and what he means for our world today. And we're very fortunate to have one of the premier lecturers at Emory University, Dr. Allett, here tonight. I gave you a little bio on your tables of Dr. Allett, so I'm not going to go through all of this. But you can see that he's a very distinguished scholar, the Cahoon Family Professor of American History Professor, specializing in religious, intellectual, and environmental history. He's written a number of books. Most relevant to tonight is Catholic Converts, British and American Intellectuals Turn to Rome. And if you like Patrick's lectures, you can actually go to the Teaching Company, which does videos, and you can order more of his lectures. And I even gave the little how you can find them online on this little bio. So there's a shameless plug for Patrick. I have no stock in the Teaching Company. I'm not getting any funds for saying that, but they tend to pick really, really good professors to do these courses, and he's got a number of them, including one on how to teach, which all teachers, including myself, would be well advised to take a look at. So with that, I think you've got an idea of sort of what the importance of tonight and our speaker. We're very thrilled that you are here tonight, and I think you're in for a very special evening. With that, Patrick?
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here. In 1954, Robert Bolt, an Englishman, wrote a play called A Man for All Seasons. And it was performed on BBC Radio and was very successful. Then it was turned into a play which was performed on the stage in the London West End. Then it went on to Broadway. And finally, in 1966, it was turned into a Hollywood film, which I dare say some of you have seen. It's the story of Thomas More, who was one of the advisors to King Henry VIII of England at the time when Henry wanted to get divorced from Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, because Catherine hadn't managed to give him a male heir, which was a source of grave concern to medieval kings. And the play traces what happens to Thomas More as the king asks him to arrange for an adequate reason for getting away from the Vatican and an adequate reason to justify the royal divorce. And this is something which More finds himself unable to do. And it's really, the play is about a conscience in conflict. And finally, More realizes that if he won't cooperate, he's going to lose his job, and eventually he's going to lose his life as well. But nevertheless, he does it. Now, what's interesting about the play is that the author, Robert Bolt, was an atheist. And yet, nevertheless, he clearly makes Thomas More the hero, a man whose flinty determination not to violate his own conscience makes him a heroic figure. And thinking about Thomas More, he's one of those people now who everybody is in favor of. He's remembered very, very fondly by intellectuals as one of the great Renaissance humanists. He's a hero of the Catholic Church. In fact, he's a saint. St. Thomas More School is here in town. And he's also very widely loved by English Protestants who regard him as a decent and honest and upright fellow who, even though he wouldn't cooperate with the founding of the Church of England, nevertheless deserves our respect. Now, history itself is a very strange and volatile business. Periodically, people who were very, very controversial in their lifetimes become universally regarded as a good thing later on. Why is it that they lose the controversy and become universally regarded as good? Let me give you two more examples before I get on to the main point. Another one is George Orwell. Again, I'm sure you've all read books by George Orwell. He was a strange, eccentric English socialist. His first job was in the Imperial Burmese Police as part of the British Empire. He left the police and wrote a book denouncing it, Burmese Days. He was a member of the Independent Labour Party, but poured scorn on the English trade unions on much of what the Labour Party was doing. He went off to fight in the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s, but fought with the Catalan anarchists, a very odd group. But then, and died prematurely, died of lung cancer in 1949 or 50. But by now, everybody thinks that George Orwell is a good thing. And he's liked for different reasons by different groups. He's certainly venerated by the British left as one of the most luminous writers they ever had. But what's significant to me is that he's also venerated by the American right. In the 1980s, for example, there was a George Orwell society made up of American right-wing neoconservatives who said Orwell understood what communism is really like. He understood the implacable evil of communism, and you wouldn't catch him making détente treaties with the Russians. Détente is a fatal mistake. Orwell knew it. So everybody likes him. One more example is that of Martin Luther King. Think how controversial King was in his own day. Bitterly hated by segregationists, obviously. A source of a terrible headache to President Kennedy, because Kennedy knew that the way to win if you're a Democrat was to have the solid white South, and that if you became too enthusiastic about African Americans, you'd start losing them. And he wasn't even particularly admired inside his own denomination. Quite a lot of the black Southern Baptists, including the leader of his denomination, said, it's wrong to preach politics from the pulpit. You ought not to be doing it. Now, by contrast, a few decades after his death, King is universally regarded as a good thing. I mean, so much so that we have a national holiday named after him. That's about as far as it can go, isn't it? Striking, I think, that he's very, very widely admired in the African American community, among Democrats, but also among Republicans, who say King was exactly the kind of person we wanted, because he believed in color blindness. He would have been completely opposed, they say, to affirmative action programs. Yeah, the content of a man's character, not the color of his skin. All right, so there are three examples, Thomas More, George Orwell, and Martin Luther King, who were controversial in their day and now universally regarded as good. This doesn't mean that people who are controversial are always going to become good. Some become bad. Let me give you one more example on the other side, the example of Mussolini. Back in the 1920s, not only was Mussolini widely admired in Italy, he was also very widely admired in the United States and in England. He'd finally given Italy a vision of strength and unity and determination. He made the trains run on time, and so on. Well, he was controversial in a different way, but now, of course, everyone detests Mussolini, and it's impossible to find a good word to be said about him. So what I'd like to emphasize here is that history itself is a very volatile thing, and it keeps changing its estimation of different people's reputations. But at the moment, there is a new man for all seasons, and by a beautiful symmetry of the language, his name is Newman. What could be more sweet than that? Once controversial, now regarded as a very good thing. And as Philip said a moment ago, he was made, the process of canonization goes in stages. Back in 1991, he was made the Venerable John Newman. This year, the Pope came to England and beatified him, so now he's the Blessed John Newman. And it's highly probable and reasonable to think that before very long he'll become a saint. So why was he once controversial, and why did he later become just good? So what I'd like to do now is describe first a little bit about him, and then a little bit about the history of his reputation since his death. He was born in 1801 into a prosperous London middle-class family. His father was a banker, and he was the oldest of 6 children. He went to school in Ealing, in the western suburbs of London. And when he was 15, he had a profound religious experience, became convinced of the rightness and truth of Christianity. And from then on, right through until his death at the age of 89, he lived and breathed Christianity. It was a deep, deep, lifelong obsession. And everything he did came straight back to the question of his faith. He went to Oxford, to Trinity College, Oxford, and studied so hard, so fervently, that he had a kind of breakdown just before he took his exams. So he was one of those, you know how now and again you do badly in an exam and you think, well, so-and-so did badly in their exams. Newman's one of these people who you can console yourself with if something goes wrong. But he was so widely recognized as one of the really outstanding figures in the Oxford of his day that even so he was given a fellowship at Oriel College, which in those days was one of the few colleges which had a lively intellectual life. Oxford in the 1820s was a somnolent place, but there was some life at Oriel College. Now, he first became famous because in the 1830s, he was one of the leaders of the so-called Oxford movement, the Tractarians, a group of divines led by John Keble, Newman himself, and Hurrell Froude at first, who became dissatisfied with the condition of the Church of England. And there were two things that they disliked. It was too obvious that the Church of England was just a branch of the state. As you probably know, America has got the separation of church and state because of the First Amendment, whereas Britain has the unity of church and state. Yeah? And one of the interests of the Church of England is to keep as many people in as possible. Now, one of the things that Newman didn't like was the fact that clearly when a decision was made at the highest levels, it was made for political reasons, not ecclesiastical ones. It was very difficult for English Christians to believe that they were part of a supernatural society and that it was God who presided over it. But that's what Newman wanted. Most of the English clergy were latitudinarians. That is, they favoured plenty of latitude in doctrine. I'm a member of the Church of England, and it's this kind of joke when you're growing up as an Anglican that if somebody says to the vicar, "I'm a revolutionary Maoist," the answer is, "Oh, there's a place for you here in the Church of England." Doctrinally, it's about as broad as it can possibly be. And of course, there was something to be said for the latitudinarian position, because it is true that for centuries, religious war between Protestants and Catholics and all kinds of horrible things had been done in the name of doctrinal precision. So it was understandable. But Newman was against it. And he was also against the evangelicals in the Church of England, really in the heritage of Wesley and Whitefield, the two great 18th century evangelical inspiring figures. Because in Newman's view, evangelicalism depended upon excessive emotion. He said, you don't want to be convinced of the rightness of Christianity when you're in an exalted emotional state. You want to be convinced of it when you're in your right mind. This is a thing for calm people to approximate. And you've got to get the doctrines exactly right. He was afraid that the evangelicals were substituting enthusiasm for doctrinal precision, and that was something which made him very uncomfortable. Now, he was the vicar or the parish priest of the University of Oxford itself. And if you've been to Oxford, you probably have a vision of St. Mary's Church. It's a beautiful church right on the middle of the high street, just across the road from Oriel College. And every Sunday at 4, he would preach the sermon. Now, because he wasn't one of the evangelicals, he wasn't the kind of passionately inspiring preacher that, for example, George Whitefield had been, or that Charles Grandison Finney was at that time in America. Apparently, he always stood behind the lectern and read his lecture, and it was all written out in full Victorian prose. But he had a magnetic effect on his audiences, and generations of people who listened to them, including people like Matthew Arnold and Gladstone, later the Prime Minister, all attested to the fact that he was an incredibly impressive speaker. And every one of these sermons dealt seriously with points of doctrine. He became interested in the church fathers. That is, the people who in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries had originally hammered out the various controversies in the early Christian church, and was convinced that he'd got to get them exactly right. Now, at first, he had an idea called the idea of the via media, the middle way. This is a very common rhetorical strategy which we see politicians doing all the time. He said, the great thing about the Church of England is that it steers the middle way between the superstitions of the Catholics over here, and between the blunt icon-smashing characteristics of the Protestants over here. We've got a teaching authority, but we haven't got the accretions of superstition that the Catholics have. The middle way, the via media. And for a while, he was convinced that this was true. But then, he was constantly studying the heresies of the early church. And finally, when he got onto the study of the Monophysite heresy, he noticed that the Monophysites had also said that they represented the middle way. And for him, that was a serious alarm bell. In fact, he wrote in one of his diaries, he said, I looked in the mirror, I saw my face in the mirror, and I was a Monophysite. Because not many people know what that means. Never mind. And increasingly, what struck him from his study of the Church Fathers was the way in which the Vatican, the Pope, had repeatedly steered the appropriate path through a great maze of heretical tendencies, and had always somehow come out in what seemed to him the best position. And it began to make him wonder, maybe this really is the church which Jesus appointed, and which is preserving the deposit of faith from Christ's time right down to the present. Now, the great flashpoint of his life as an Anglican came in 1841 when he published Tract 90. This was the 90th in this series of tracts that he and his friends had written. Because in Tract 90 he said, the governing documents which regulate the Church of England, the 39 articles, can be read in a way which is completely compatible with Catholic teaching. That was a very, very shocking claim at the time, and it led to a horrified outcry in Oxford itself. In fact, it was condemned by 24 of the English bishops, including his own bishop, the Bishop of Oxford. Now, I need to digress at this point to explain to you the relations between Protestants and Catholics. I mean, these days it's true, isn't it, that we regard Protestants and Catholics as variations of Christianity, and certainly here at Emory and throughout the United States, they get on very happily together. Which of you knows somebody who hates Protestants on principle? Or hates Catholics on principle? I mean, there probably are such people, but they're very, very rare, and it's bad manners to say so, even if you think it, isn't it? Yeah. Now, things could not have been more different in England of 1840. Then, the majority of the English people didn't regard Catholics as another group of Christians. They regarded them as the antithesis of Christians. The whore of Rome and the scarlet woman, Antichrist, a terrifying vision of Catholics as a grotesque parody of Christianity, polar antagonists. They could not have been more different from each other. That was the idea of what Catholics were like then. And so for Newman to be saying, actually, we can read our documents in this Catholic light, was a horrifying thing to be told. The best-selling book in England between the Reformation and the 1830s, apart from the Bible, was Fox's Book of Martyrs. And it's in 12 volumes, the original version, and it's all about the brutality of the English Catholics under Queen Mary I as they sent the heroes of the Reformation to be burned at the stake and so on. And generations of English kids were brought up on this to learn about the demonic character of the Catholics. That's why it's so frightening to many Anglicans that Newman should be saying things like this. Oh, and also, I should just tell you, little anecdotes like this. If you asked English school children in those days, why did the Royal Navy beat the Spanish Armada? And the answer was, because a Protestant wind blew in the English Channel. The Protestant wind. This sort of idea that God himself intervenes with things like the weather to make sure that the Protestant cause triumphs. All right. Well, after this explosion over Tract 90, Newman resigned his position at St. Mary's and resigned his position at Oriel College and withdrew to a little village called Littlemore, which is near Oxford, for even more intense study of the Church Fathers. And this is what he says about that period in his life. It's interesting, I think. He says, I was always asking myself, what would the Fathers have done? What would those whose works were around my room, whose names were ever meeting my eyes, whose authority was ever influencing my judgment, what would these men have said? How would they have reacted to my position? I'd made a good case on paper, but what judgment would be passed on it by Athanasius, Basil, Gregory, Hilary, and Ambrose? The more I considered the matter, the more I thought that these fathers, if they examined my antagonists' pleas, would give the case against me. Now, and it's interesting, isn't it? You know that evangelical phrase, what would Jesus do? See, this starts the same way, doesn't it? What would the fathers do? Yes, so it's exactly the same thing. And for him, of course, this was deadly serious. In 1845, he converted and became a Roman Catholic. And again, it caused more uproar. I mean, the only way in which I can give you a sense of how astonishing that was, imagine if in 1960, Billy Graham had said, I'm becoming a communist. Or if in the year 2005, President George W. Bush had said, I'm now becoming an Islamic jihadist. In other words, it's sort of becoming the very embodiment of exactly what you're fighting against. And suddenly, here's this man, a prominent man in English public life, one of the handful of the most eminent Anglicans, is making this claim. He's going over to the enemy. That's how it seemed to many people in his own day. And having become convinced that it was the right thing to do, that the Catholic Church really did hold the truth, the religious truth, he was determined to do it at all costs. And he was so influential that a large number of other people came with him. And there was lots of other people who had been influenced by Newman's preaching and writing, also converted to Catholicism. Now, one of the best fictional transfigurations we've got of all this comes in the novels of Anthony Trollope. I don't know if you're Trollope fans, but they're magnificent books, and he wrote a great string of them in the 1850s. And in one of them, Barchester Towers, there's an Anglican divine called Francis Arabin. And in Barchester Towers, he says something like this. Francis Arabin had studied at the feet of the great Newman. He was high church, very high. So high, indeed, that he almost toppled over into the cesspool of Rome. And again, obviously from Trollope, Trollope's witty about everything, but this beautifully gives the feeling of this horrified reaction to what had happened. Lots of people wrote him angry letters. I'll read you one of them. Thomas Arnold, the brother of Matthew Arnold, he converted as well. And his wife wrote a letter to Newman which said, "You have persuaded my husband to ignore every social duty and become a pervert. From the bottom of my heart, I curse you for it." And when her husband was being confirmed in the Catholic chapel, she threw rocks through the window. She was smashing the windows of the Catholic chapel from outside. This is the kind of intensity of feeling it aroused. Now, when he became a Catholic, nothing in the world of the English Catholics was attractive to Newman. It was made up of a handful of old English Catholic aristocrats who'd held on to the ancient faith through centuries of persecution, on the one hand, and then crowds of recent Irish immigrants. This is just at the time of the terrible Irish famine, when large numbers of Irishmen are coming into England. And he regarded them as brutal savages. I mean, he wasn't the least bit sympathetic to them as people, even though he now recognized that they shared membership in Christ's true society. He went to Rome to study for the priesthood, and he didn't like it there either, because he was instantly struck by how inferior the seminarians were and their teachers. He said, I'm being taught by people who are pathetically ignorant. All the difficult intellectual questions which have been agonizing me for the last 20 years, they're not asking. They're just teaching in simple syllogisms as though all this stuff was easy. He had bed bugs. He hated the cruelty of the Romans towards horses. In every way, he found it a sort of horrifying place. And of course, what he'd done was he'd left the real center of English society, where he was an honored and important and significant and respected man, and he'd gone out to what looked to him like this barbaric periphery. It was really an incredible thing to have done. And to make matters worse, it isn't even as though the Catholic community into which he'd now moved was grateful. On the contrary, many of them very soon started thinking, Newman's trouble. Yeah, he's difficult, he's awkward, he's temerarious, he's uncooperative. The thing about Newman is this: he was very, very intellectually daring. That's why he'd done this thing in the first place. It wasn't because he was friends with Catholics that he'd converted. He read his way into it through 20 years of intensive study. And of course, because he'd got that intellectual adventurousness, he wasn't going to stop. Now that he'd become a Catholic, now what he wanted to do was to persuade all the other Anglicans to join him in the Catholic Church and say to the Catholics, this is what you need to do now to advance the cause of your own church and to make it successful hereafter. But many of them didn't appreciate that because they had a far more defensive mentality and were afraid that he was raising awkward questions and that they wouldn't like the answers he might give. It was at this time that he published the Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine. This is the last work he wrote as an Anglican, and by the time he'd converted, it was published by the time he'd become a Catholic. And the essay says, look, how are we going to get to terms with the fact that clearly Christianity keeps changing? It is not the case that the Christianity we've got now in 19th century Europe is the same as it was in the 3rd century. And he knew a lot about the 3rd century. This was a huge issue for him. And so he says, is it, as some liberal Christians say, that we've simply changed? We've changed the teachings and we've changed the doctrines and we've invented the cult of the saints and we've invented papal supremacy. He said, no, it's not that. What's actually going on is the development of doctrines. And he uses 3 very, very good analogies. He says, when you look at a little bud, you can't tell that it's going to become a flower. It looks completely different. And yet, the flower, when it's opened, had got all the capacity to become that flower when it was just the bud. Look at an old man. It's impossible to believe when you look at an old man that he was once a baby, but he was, and the baby contained the old man in chrysalis. Think about a little stream high in the mountains. It becomes a great river. It's the same thing. And he said, Christian doctrine is like that. It's always changing and developing, but it's developing along lines which were intrinsic to it right from the beginning. And in fact, he says, a very famous quotation, here he is, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. That's a lovely remark, isn't it? Because I think most of his Catholic antagonists at that time, or fellow co-religionists, would not have made a remark like that. Their view was, it's always the same. Now, it's the same now and it always has been. All right, later on he wrote a little article called On Consulting the Faithful in Matters of Doctrine. And again, his superiors didn't like the sound of that at all. They didn't think he should consult the faithful. But and when he was explaining this away, it was dilated. It was sent off to Rome and subjected to close scrutiny. He said, well, look, when I want to know what time it is, I consult my watch. And if I want to know what train to catch, I consult the timetable. I don't ask the timetable's opinion, but I do consult it. I look to see what it says. And he says, in the same way, one of the most reliable ways in which Catholic leadership can know if it's acting appropriately is by consulting the faithful. In the sense of just looking at them and seeing what it is that they believe and what it is that they do. In other words, they're an immense repository of kind of common wisdom and faith to which the leadership needs to be able to respond. Again, this was an idea which the hierarchy was not familiar with. Now, another thing that dismayed him was that having come from the Protestant side of this very, very sharp antagonism, he then changed sides, and he found that the Catholics were at least as antagonistic to the Protestants from their side. Not surprisingly, in view of the difficult things they'd had to put up with over the foregoing years. But in a letter to one of his fellow converts, he wrote this: "If any human agency is to be made God's instrument in any part of this work, surely it must begin by acknowledging, not denying, what Protestants have that is good and true, and honouring it in them as coming from the one source of all light and holiness. Certainly, to my own mind, one of the most afflicting and discouraging elements in the action of Catholicism just now on English society is the scorn with which some of us treat proceedings and works among Protestants." In other words, how are we ever going to reconcile the two? How are we going to begin this process of bringing the other Anglicans into the Catholic Church when we ourselves are so nasty to them and always impute to them bad motives? That's what we've got to stop doing. And of course, this is a classic example of what sociologists call cognitive dissonance. See, from Newman's point of view, the Anglicans and the Catholics were very close. The Catholics were right and the Anglicans were wrong, but nevertheless they were close. And most of what the Anglicans did could be regarded as entirely reasonable and Christian. But for most of the people who hadn't crossed the divide, they were very, very far apart indeed. So in effect, what he's trying to do is to bring together groups who are not used to the idea of themselves being proximate. Another of his most interesting writings is called An Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent. And that's where he gets into the question, how do you come to believe something, especially questions of faith? One of his friends was a man called William Froude, the brother of Hurrell Froude. William Froude was an empirical scientist who said doubt is a good principle. He was an engineer, and he said, I have to test materials all the time in the expectation that they're going to fail. He said, the problem with you, your religious beliefs, is that you're making claims of faith which go far, far beyond the evidence. And Newman was interested in this question. Yes, why is it that we believe when we haven't got the direct access of the senses to proof of the existence of God? He was dissatisfied with the traditional Catholic answer to the question of the proof of the existence of God and was looking for alternative ways. And it's a very interesting essay speculating about religious psychology, where he says, somebody can prove something to you by logic, but you don't really feel it. In other words, you haven't taken possession of it until you do something more than that. And he says, and besides, it's not as though we're just logical machines, is it? We've got emotions, and we've got memories, and we've got sympathies. He talks about the way in which faith is a matter of complete assent. He actually invented a term for it, the illative sense. We've got a sense which goes beyond the conventional boundaries of the reasons for faith and just makes this I guess we'd call it an existential assent. Let me read you what I can find here. Yes, man is not a reasoning animal alone. He is a seeing, feeling, contemplating, acting animal. It is the concrete being that reasons. Apart from anything else, he said, look, different people have got different life experiences. So when they hear a proof for something, they bring their experiences to that proof, and it's going to be more convincing to some than to others. It's a very, very complicated matter which you've got to come to terms with. Well, this also was sent to Rome under suspicion of heresy because it denied the idea that the existence of God and the rightness of Catholicism could be proved logically, which the church authorities believed was the case. Now, another thing that was going on is that lots of other people were converting to Catholicism as well in England and America. One of them was a man he knew slightly called Henry Manning. Manning converted 6 years later than Newman in 1851, but Manning was a very different kind of person. Brilliant at ecclesiastical politics. He lived and breathed church politics. It wasn't long before he'd realised that to be an influential person in the Catholic Church, you'd got to be a good Italian speaker. He loved it in Rome. He was great. He could hang out at a papal conclave and get to know everybody. He was a political schmoozer. He was a very, very effective organizer, and so on. Newman is Newman is an intellectual, and Manning was a doer. Now, they also disagreed about how they should think about the position of the Catholic Church in England. Manning was an ultramontane. Oh, is there a marker here? Oh, there is, yeah. If you imagine being in England, this is a very, very primitive geography lesson. If this is England, and that's Rome, and you're looking from one to the other, one of the things, I mean, you have the English Channel, but then you also have the Alps, okay? And one group, Manning's group, the ultramontanes, are the people who are looking over the mountain, ultramontanes, beyond the mountains to Rome. And they're saying, we're going to do what they do in Rome. Yeah, that's what Roman Catholicism is all about. The other group are called the Cisalpines, which means this side of the Alps. In other words, let's do what the English Catholics have been doing for centuries. They've had a terrible struggle. Let's not make matters even worse for them now. Let's keep it at home. Let's domesticate Catholicism to its English ways. This is what Newman wanted to do. And so that's one of the ways in which they came into conflict with each other. Here's what Manning said. I fear an English Catholicism of which Newman is the highest type. It is the old Anglican, patristic, literary, Oxford University tone transplanted into the church. It is worldly Catholicism. And Manning said, that's no good. He said, what I want is downright, masculine, and decided Catholics, more Roman than Rome, and more ultramontane than the Pope himself. Yeah? So even among these converts, there's disagreements. And it is true, incidentally, that Newman was a very, very English kind of Englishman. He was one of those people who takes the view that everyone who isn't English is foreign, and that foreigners are bad. I mean, he wasn't that bad, but there's an element of that too. He did have a lovely trip to Sicily once, but he certainly wasn't a great traveller. Anyway, there we are. So in his lifetime, he was widely liked, but widely disliked and mired in controversy. So now I'm going to move to this question. Why is it that now you can't find anybody to say a word against Newman? What's happened in the meantime to make him so popular? And I'm just going to briefly suggest 6 reasons. Well, first of all, in the long run, the intellectuals tend to get the best of it. They tend to be neglected in their own day, and they tend to get the best of it in the long run. It's because Manning was a far less eloquent writer than Newman, and also actually because Manning's first biographers were venomously hostile. Manning has usually been depicted as the villain of the two, and Newman's depicted as the one who got it right. And even people who are aware of this still tend to have a sort of pro-Newman sympathy, because they tend to be academic types who like the scrupulosity of Newman's works. One of Newman's best books is the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, the story of his own religious life. In 1861, he was accused by Charles Kingsley, an evangelical Christian, of being cynical in his use of the truth. And it was a deeply, deeply hurtful remark to Newman, who set about writing the history of his religious opinions to vindicate the fact that he'd been absolutely sincere at every stage of his religious journey. Incidentally, Charles Kingsley annoyed everybody. He called Baptist ministers muck enthroned on their respective dunghills. So it isn't as though he was only insulting the Catholics, not at all. Now, the thing about the Apologia that Newman wrote in the 60s is that it's a very, very powerful, beautiful book, and it had an enormously favourable effect in restoring his reputation among his old Anglican friends. People who felt that he'd committed an act of betrayal, after reading the Apologia, forgave him, and that began the process of reintegrating Newman into the canon of English literature, really, and saying, it's a good thing in that sense. And he was a beautiful stylist as well. Second, he's popular now, I think, because aspects of his work can appeal to different groups in different ways. In this sense, he's comparable to George Orwell. He later reprinted nearly all his Anglican works and stood by them. He said, there's nothing in most of this work which Catholics can't also learn from. There's a continuity in my work across my whole lifetime, first half as an Anglican, second half as a Catholic. And because of that, he's now a very, very important figure in the Anglican theological tradition, despite the unusual outcome of his life as an Anglican. The effects of the Oxford movement, of which he'd been a member, are very important. The reason Anglicans and Episcopalians in America take communion every week, if they're regular churchgoers, is because the Oxford movement restored it. The robes which English choir boys wear, the fact that the English bishops wear mitres, the fact that the churches are beautifully decorated, these are all contributions of the Oxford movement to a church which had become stained and dull and disorganized and very unliturgical. But among Catholics, he's equally honoured. In fact, so much so that when the Second Vatican Council met in the years 1962 to 65, Pope Paul VI, who took over halfway through the council, said, "This is Newman's council." Yeah? Newman was attentive to the laity, and he trusted the laity, as you could see from that essay I mentioned. He was more scriptural than most Catholics at the time, and that's a move in which the Catholics now need to make. Advocates of intellectual freedom love him because he said, there's unity in truth. It's not possible for truths to be in conflict. Sometimes they might seem to be, but if we have faith in the unity of truth, and if we let people follow their researches wherever it takes them, eventually they're going to find that the truth is one. He hated the idea of censorship or restriction or prohibition. In 1863 he wrote, "You cannot make men believe by force and repression. Were the Holy See as powerful in temporals as it was 3 centuries back, then you would have secret infidelity instead of an avowed one. In other words, it's much better to have avowed infidelity because it's something you can combat openly. And the way to do it is with intellectual freedom. Of course, the church should be forming your conscience and guiding you, but nevertheless, it's an atmosphere of intellectual freedom." But on the other hand, Catholic conservatives like Pope John Paul II and like the current Pope, Benedict, can also admire many of the things that Newman said, such as this. This is the speech he made on the eve of the ceremony which made him a cardinal in 1878. "I rejoice to say that to one great mischief I have from the first been opposed. For 30, 40, 50 years I have resisted to the best of my powers the spirit of liberalism in religion. Liberalism in religion is the doctrine that there is no positive truth in religion, but that one creed is as good as another. This is the teaching which is gaining force and substance daily. It is inconsistent with any recognition of religion as true. It teaches that revealed religion is not a truth, but a sentiment or a taste." So there he is saying that for 50 years he's been completely opposed to that view, which of course it lends itself to the conservative thing. Third, he's popular now because he was a developmental thinker. I mean, he lived at the same time as people like Charles Darwin, and he was very enthusiastic about Darwin's work on the evolution of species. Charles Lyell, the geologist who theorized the creation of the rock strata. Karl Marx, a developmental theorist of the development of societies, through the stage of primitive accumulation to the beginnings of capitalism and the proletarian revolution and so on. Lots of 19th century theories about the stages of history. And here's one more. When he writes the essay on the development of doctrine, he's making the same kind of argument. And he's trying to say Catholics can keep up with the trends of intellectual life going on in the world around us. Fourth, popular because he's such an articulate advocate of the liberal arts ideal in his book, The Idea of a University. And this is a book which everybody likes. They read it selectively because it talks really about the centrality of theology, which not all its advocates share. But listen to this. Here's a remark about it from the English Marxist critic, Terry Eagleton. Yeah? Who on the face of it would have no sympathy for Newman at all, and yet he does. He says, "In the plan for his Catholic university, Newman's generosity of spirit can be seen at its finest. He speaks up for an intercommunion of all the principal academic disciplines and for disinterested scholarly inquiry. The task of a university is to foster intellectual culture for its own sake, which means that it can be the tool of neither church nor state." And Eagleton goes on to compare that with the English educational bureaucrats, whom he describes as the vandals, philistines, and soulless bureaucrats who are currently destroying our places of higher learning. Fifth, he's popular because now miracles have been attributed to him. This is a necessary stage in beatification and canonization. And sixth, he's popular because he's very useful as a stick which people can pick up to beat the current state of the Catholic Church or the current state of the world. One of his recent biographers, John Cornwell, in an article in the New Statesman, spends a lot of time comparing him to Pope Benedict, who beatified him, very much to Newman's advantage. And he says, Newman always believed in intellectual openness, but look at the Pope. He was constantly covering up the sex scandals, and look what a mess it's led to. So in other words, he's used for the point of contrast there. People who are Catholics but they're angry with their church in some way love one of the remarks that Newman made in his letter to the Duke of Norfolk, where he says, in drinking a toast, he says, "I'll drink a toast to the Pope, to conscience first and the Pope afterwards." Yeah, in other words, the conscience is more important. And of course, if you've got a beef with the church, that's a very useful thing to be able to say. Now let me finish by just telling you one very, very strange tale. I think it's strange anyway. If you're going to be beatified, one of the things that they do is they actually dig up your mortal remains to make sure that the prayers which are then said are directed specifically to the person in question and not to those buried around. Now, the last request that Newman made was to be buried beside his lifelong friend Ambrose St. John. They've been friends for a very long time. An English journalist who's also a gay rights advocate called Peter Tatchell regarded this as a horrible sacrilege and a violation of the gay John Newman. He says, it's a violation of Newman's dying wish and a further example of Catholic homophobia. Anyway, and he then did a BBC TV programme in which he tried to make the case for the gay Newman. Well, Newman's best biographer, Ian Kerr, I think has successfully refuted this claim. But whether it's right or wrong, surely what's interesting from our point of view is that even the gay community in England thought, we want Newman as well. Everybody wants Newman. So there you are. That's the process by which, from being bitterly controversial in his own day, Newman also has become a new man for all seasons. Thanks very much indeed. Absolutely, yes.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.